All right, Unit 3, here we go. So, what we're going to talk about today is we're going to spend some time talking about what are going to be the unintended consequences of the Enlightenment. So, the Enlightenment comes along, it gets rolling in the 1600s, and by, I would say, if we take a look by the 1700s, we are pretty well vested in the movements of the Enlightenment. Science is starting to roll ahead pretty aggressively. And we see, obviously, in 1776, we have the American Revolution. The American Revolution is based on deism and the Enlightenment and moving away from divine right and the power of the king and the power of a foreign power without having representation and the role of the individual and their responsibility and self-governance, all of those things that we talked about in the last unit. And so science is going to start screaming ahead during this period. And there's going to be some pretty radical impacts on society and individuals who live in these Western societies that are starting to scientifically advance. And a lot of them will be beneficial in the long run, but in the short run, there's going to be some pretty dire consequences to that rush into modernization. And so obviously there's going to be a shift in energy. And so we're going to start to see, I don't know why that moved there. Okay. We're going to start to see a lot of technological development, primarily in the form of factory production. All the traditional modes of production are going to move away from small scale, individualized production for the sake, let's say, like weaving. And weaving is going to become mechanized, and fabrics will become mechanized. And London will be producing massive amounts of fabric and needing cotton shipped from around the globe. And we're going to start to see supply chains starting to reach out. And this is where the British Empire is going to increase. This is where taxation of the American colonists is going to start to create problems for both the Americans and the British. And we're going to see eventually by the 1800s, by the early 1800s, we're going to see steam power moving into this production capacity and transport capacity in the form of railroads. And so let's take a step back and look at traditionally, how did energy economies work? So traditionally, you would need to grow a bunch of grass in your field. And then from that grass, you would feed that to your cows or your steers or your mules, whatever type of animals you had. And that was both your mechanical energy and your caloric energy in terms of human ingestion. And that was pretty much all the energy. If you wanted to move a giant rock somewhere, you had to feed your oxen or feed your horses or feed your mules to drag that rock. And that was the only way to get that rock from point A to point B. And now with the advent of steam power, there you can use coal or you can use wood, and that can be turned into mechanical energy to move things around. And that may not seem like that big of a deal, but it is a major shift in humanity's energy use and energy consumption from grass to coal, or from photosynthesis to coal. So that's going to lead to large scale industrialization. The other thing that that's going to lead to is fewer people needing, because of the mechanical advantage, the new technologies, the harnessing of steel, fewer people are going to have to live on the farm growing grass and growing vegetables and growing agricultural products. And more people are going to be needed in these cities to work in these factories and further progress that industrialized economy, obviously with the input of steam power fueling that. So as this starts to happen, we're going to have the growth of cities is going to be massive. In a few decades during the early 1800s in London, we are going to see populations go from a few 100,000 to over 1 million. And so a 5 times increase in a fairly short period of time. And so let's look at, as we start moving into this industrialized era due to technological developments as a byproduct of scientific knowledge, it's really important to look at what happens, especially as we look at environmental issues, environmental imagination, how we conceive of the environment moving forward, to what happens to population densities and population growth during this time period. So if you take a look at this starts at 10,000 BCE, and here's 0, and here's 2000. And if you look right in this period right here, you can start to see a massive climb from 1700 to 1800 to 1900, a massive climb in global population numbers. And almost all of this is going to be a byproduct of these pieces that we looked at over here. So if you take a look at any species in any environment, there is one factor that determines whether or not a species, a population, a group of in this case, people, can increase their numbers. If back here, you're a hunter gatherer, you're tribal people, you're living in a caloric economy that doesn't include steam power or gasoline power, solar powered, there is only one way that your people increases the number, and this has always been the case and always will be the case, is that you need excess sorry, you need excess food. And so if you don't have food, more food than you need, plus food, your population will not grow in size. You need to have extra. So if you have 10 people and you have just enough food for 10 people, after 10 years, you are going to have 10 people. But let's say you have 10 people and then eventually your tribe over the course, or your hunter gatherer society has enough food for 50 people, you're going to have more babies who survive, elderly who have longer life expectancies, and so your group of people will increase in population. This industrialization that's going to occur right here is going to create enough excess food that our population can continue to grow quite quickly. And so this has some positives and some negatives. Obviously, the positives are technological advancements move humanity forward, but they also inevitably lead to a lot of social and environmental issues. As you can see here in the 1800s, this is a lithograph from London. London was insanely polluted to the point where you could not see the sky. It would make LA or some of our metropolitan areas today look unpolluted by comparison. There was this rapid urbanization over just a few short decades in a time period when engineering wasn't nearly as good as it is today. We were rarely using metal in our structures anywhere in Europe or the United States. So you had these large metropolitan areas that were built almost entirely out of wood. There's no electricity, there's no sanitation, there's no running water. There would be literally sewage flowing in the streets. Dead animals sometimes would be left in the streets for days before somebody would, be organized enough to remove it. I mean, imagine moving a dead horse from an urban street. The level of sanitation led to a number of disease issues, and we had widespread outbreaks of all sorts of communicable diseases throughout these urban areas. And it was not a pretty place to live. In fact, it was a really nasty, nasty place to live. And not entirely the fault of the scientific method, but very much as I mentioned, an unintended consequence of technological development, industrialization fueled by advancements in science. And so when we get to this period, we see a lot of art coming out of this period. This picture is actually a little bit after, obviously. This is from later in the 1800s, but we see a lot of dire existence and living in these cities. So many of these people that would move to the cities, they had come from a pastoral life living on farms in rural communities, and they were economically required or found that they were, and sometimes forced just through economic means, but many times they would leave the agricultural centers of Europe and the United States and move into these large metropolitan areas for work. And then once they got there, they would be in tenement housing that was massively overcrowded, full of disease, poor wages, poor living conditions, poor food access, and there would be oftentimes runaway fires. This is where we get volunteer fire departments and fire brigades that would start to pop up because these wooden structures with lots of people heating with oil, these oil lamps would fall over, the structures would begin to burn, and they would sweep through urban areas, killing sometimes by the thousands. So at the same time, we had factory work, and in the factories there were a lot of children would start working at the age of 5, sometimes even 4. They would be required to work 6 days a week, and they would be often required to work 12 to 16 hours a day. And so the conditions obviously were dire. Limbs would be lost. These were poorly lit factories. Obviously, no safety measures whatsoever. So, one of the ways that we can look at how dire this period was for these people living in these cities, working in these lower class people coming off the farms, working in these cities, is you could watch life expectancies. And so during this time period in major metropolitan areas, both in the US and in Europe, and these are rough numbers, but the life expectancy was about 35 years old across all economic life expectancy across all economic groups. However, we know that frequently, if you are in a lower or a poor class, or if you are wealthy, oftentimes there are different life expectancies. And so in many of these places, the life expectancy for factory workers who made up a large portion of the population of these cities, the life expectancy was a little over 19 years old. And so there was a lot of death, a lot of death. And so, as you can imagine, if you start working this kind of work schedule at 5 years old, and you don't get a disease, you don't get burned in a fire, if you don't have a work accident, if you don't have any of these things that, might kill you, 19 years old was your average life expectancy. Obviously, if you're wealthy, not working in the factories, maybe you had a little bit better health care at the time, a little bit better sanitation. I think the average life expectancy was around 50 to 55, depending on where you look. So people weren't too stoked on this new life that they're being asked to live. And so this is a well-known lithograph from a poor person paddling across the river in London, the Thames, and we see, obviously, it's death, and they're a factory worker paddling home through this terribly polluted river because people used to just dump dead things in the river all the time. I think that's maybe a dead pig or something like that. Here's another dead animal. And animal carcasses would just be dumped into these urban rivers as a way to get rid of them. And all of that rotting ooze of carcass would just flood out into the ocean. So pretty bad. And so what ends up happening is that anytime there's something like the Enlightenment. So we're looking at major philosophical periods, and we haven't talked about the ones before the Enlightenment, but the Enlightenment occurs, and the Enlightenment brings some good things, brings democracy, it brings a shift in self-governance. But then there's a reaction, because any philosophical or social period has downsides. It's not all rosy, it's not all good. And so there is a natural reaction, usually, I'll call this a social reaction to the aspects of whatever philosophical guiding principles occur at a time. We're having those right now. We can get into that later in the semester, but we're every philosophical period throughout human history has eventually has a negative reaction to the bad aspects of a development. So what ends up happening is people see all this stuff and they say, yeah, I don't like this. This is bad. And so what do? They start to think about life back on the farm. And what do? Now, life back on the farm probably, I'm sure, wasn't always perfect and it wasn't always great, but they start to romanticize this and they say, yeah, take me back there. And even if it's just in their mind, even if they can't physically actually do it or economically do it, that's where their head starts to go. And so then we see this idealization of what I'm going to term for right now as the pastoral. And the pastoral is the past has that root, but also pasture in it, which pasture, the pastoral, is kind of your agrarian past. So if we continue moving ahead here, we see this in the art, we see it in the poetry, and we see this idealization of the pastoral life. And we see these, compared to obviously this skeleton paddling across the river and these people overcrowded in poor aspects of town. We see this, and we see a person on a horse, another person leading a horse, people up here putting in hay for the winter. We see grass and green and lush. And I mean, where do you want to live? Do you want to live here, or do you want to live over with that skeleton or in that busy city street? And these, again, down here, we see the same type of thing, little, cottages spread out with space, still people around. It's not void of people, but we see a family walking, a child here with a parent, once again, opposed to children over here, many of who would have been orphaned due to this low life expectancy in these urban areas. So we see this shift. And so people say, even if just intellectually or artistically, they start to say, whoa, let's go back to this period. And so this period, this next philosophical chunk after the Enlightenment, is going to be referred to as the Romantic period. Oh, I'm having trouble here. Can't focus on too many things at once. The Romantic period is going to be the next philosophical period that we jump into. And the Romantic period is going to work really well with American wilderness, real actual wilderness that America is going to have on its western border, and notions of settlement, rugged individualism. We'll talk all about those over the next couple of units. It's truly fascinating, and this is where we get a lot of our American identity comes from, this Romantic period, this idealization and return to the pastoral. So I get excited to talk about this stuff. I find this absolutely fascinating. But here's a little poem that kind of typifies this return to the wild. Alone you stand as the wind whispers, voices drift on the breeze to the ear. You look all around to see the speaker, but only the sheep are here. So this idea is that, obviously if you're in an urban environment, you're going to hear voices, but this is just the wind whispering and the voices drifting, and the speaker cannot be found, but the sheep in the pastoral can be. So simple little poem. There's lots of poems from the Lake District poets that we'll look at, and the Hudson River Valley painters will continue to look at paintings of this sort as we move into American landscape painting and how the landscape was perceived in visual illustrations and paintings. So the last thing I want to talk about is one of the videos you read talked about the categorization of the natural world. Carl Linnaeus. Carl Linnaeus went through and he created, the Latin naming system for species that I'm sure you bumped into in your biology classes. And what he was really trying to do is just to categorize. So, and once you categorize and you isolate, then you can burrow into and study uh, ecology and biology and life forms with a lot more precision. And obviously, the scientific method requires precision and, as I mentioned the other day, repeatability, verifiability, those sorts of things. And so, Carl Linnaeus was a huge help in categorizing the different components of the natural world. And so, once those things are categorize the study like ecology, the study of the relationships between organisms, their environment, and the balances between these relationships start to occur. And we can start to understand how ecosystems work. And before this, we really, as we know, we would have chalked all this up in a previous era up to nymphs and animism and kind of what we would now consider to be fairly irrational explanations of scientific processes. But Linnaeus, as a product of the scientific, would allow us to really study how ecosystems would interact. And obviously, a big focus of this class, just as a product of the book Overstory, is about trees and how trees interact with the natural world. And so we saw the fig tree and the strangler fig, and how the strangler fig operates within its environment, and how old those trees would be and how long it would take them to strangle out their host trees. So Carl Linnaeus, categorization, ecology, all going to be useful components as we continue ahead. All right. Have a good one.